Hey, Marshall.
Hey Bob, how you
How
doing?
are you? I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing the best that we can.
Yeah. Yeah, we had another family friend who was a doctor. He was an obstetrician, and he was captured by the Germans. He was in a concentration camp, Jewish guy, and boy, he wrote down his story. It's I have it. I still have it here. It's just stunning
Hmm.
what this guy went through. What the Germans did was unbelievable.
And back to this, at this rally at the Capitol, some of these people had some of those shirts. One of those phrases, 6 million's not enough or something, and
Yeah, right.
others had Auschwitz on their shirt. Are they
Yeah, saw
serious?
that. Yeah, I saw that.
I,
Hate is an interesting thing. I mean, when somebody's in pain and uncomfortable and very unhappy with their lives, it's so very convenient for them to hate others. I mean, maybe it's part of a lower part of the human condition, placing blame, instead of being self-reflective. And I mean, there's more to it than that, of course. There's just, I mean, this country, other countries, I mean, there's, the haves and have nots, and there's always racism in the mix. So, downtrodden people get pissed off and look for a receptacle for their anger. It's convenient to blame frequently the wrong party.
right.
I mean, look at this stuff with Trump, right? I mean, you think, why aren't they blaming him? I mean, he perpetrates their misery, right?
Yeah.
But they don't see it that way because he's got the gift of gab and they're buying it. But what's inexcusable is that the Congress is going along with that. I mean, some portion of the Congress, specifically the Republicans, are letting him, let him have it up till now. It's inexcusable. I mean, God, anybody from New York knew this cat to be just bad news. I mean, but people from New York didn't vote for him for president. By and large, it was people from Republican states that drank the Kool-Aid.
You're absolutely right, and that television show really helped. And speaking of downtrodden, I remember going to school in Pittsburgh. I didn't finish the story. My father did, as you know, just everyone probably knows now. My father did work really hard, and on a GI Bill, he went and became an oral surgeon. Though
I'll
they,
be darned.
when he first went to, it was a Jewish man. He worked for at a jewelry store in downtown Pittsburgh, and he was a powerful man. And he also worked as a cop at night. My mom said he was really hard working. But
Hmm.
the man wrote him a recommendation. He got into the school. When he got down to the school, they looked at him and said, "What's a nigger want to be a dentist for?"
Hmm.
And then they said no on the application. So
Huh.
that this man who owned the jewelry store went to fight for him, saying, he's a war veteran. I recommend this man, put him in the school. He did get in the school, but then they started blocking him from the right kind of assignments, etc.
Oh.
Uh, Another Jewish man, because Pittsburgh has a lot of different populations. I guess you've been there a lot, and different.
Yeah, I have.
I, another Jewish man saw what was happening, a young man his age, and said, "I see what they're doing to you, and I'm going to help get you all the assignments to get you through this." He went on to major in oral surgery. This man's son went to dental school at Pitt. My father taught there for 35 years as associate professor. His son studied with my father.
Wow.
And he told me, "Your father was the one we had to get through school. Your father was the one who was the cat of the department."
Hmm.
And he lived in Westchester County, close to where we all lived. And he came to one of my jobs, a full circle.
I'll be darned. Yeah. Isn't
But
that
I
something?
I do agree with you. My father was traumatized all of his life, and we all went through it.
Yeah.
You know, it never stopped, and you never knew when the war would begin again. You know,
Right.
and I
Right.
think you know what I'm talking about. And I
Yeah.
like people to know this in America, that this isn't a game. You know, you know.
Yeah. Well, it's a it's a racket, if you ask me. I mean, there's it's a confluence of corporations and very wealthy people running the show and making the rules and putting the politicians in their pockets. And you know, they could care less about education, about equity, about the arts, and Trump exacerbated all that. I mean, he's a slimy corporate greedy so and so, and he doesn't care about anybody. But he did a television show, and he had he learned, I think. Well, I mean, he learned before he did the television show that he could flap his lips and act like an important person, and people would buy it. Um, yeah, unfathomable that he became the president, and look where we are. I mean, it was very predictable to me. But my brother was involved in real estate since the 70s, and he used to talk about Donald Trump. Donald Trump was a terrible businessman, and he would go and borrow hundreds of millions of dollars from a bank and not pay them back. And when the bank came looking for their money, he'd say, you should be grateful that you lent money to me, and I put my name on this project.
Hmm.
And then he would walk, and guess who would pay the bill? The taxpayers. And he did that over and over and over again, and he continued to do it through his presidency. Didn't pay his bills, didn't pay his workers. Most of his projects are failed or losing money. His wealth, either he stole it or it's sort of smoke and mirrors.
Hmm.
Some kind of weird Ponzi stuff. I don't know. He's just an awful, awful human being.
Yeah, I did buy Mary Trump's book just for history's sake, though I haven't
Mm.
read it yet. But
Mhm.
she basically nails and discusses everything you're talking about, and
Yeah,
that it started from the generation before. You know,
yeah, yeah,
but honestly, living around New York since around 1986, I knew who he was. I think I even played a private party once for the man. To tell you the truth, I remember playing maybe George G. Big Band or something. You know, uh,
Mhm.
yeah, we all knew. I didn't. I just didn't think he would win. That's all.
Yeah, yeah,
You know.
yeah. He bullshitted his way in there, and people bought it.
But I got to be honest with you, man. I didn't think it would get this far. I have some friends though who did say it would go this far. You know.
Yeah. Once he got in there as president, I just thought, oh boy, we're in for some trouble now.
Mm.
Because that
Well,
meant, some portion of the country supports him, a rather large portion, although it's, not the majority, but still it's substantial.
yeah. Well, let's just hope that we can, because all I want to do is just come back and play some simple jazz gigs and try to get on with this
Amen.
last third of my life. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I'm not
Well,
trying to get deep or nothing. You know what I'm
no, 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 no.
saying?
But
I mean, but I can't even get back to you know. Well, you know.
well, this too shall pass, as they say. I mean, the 1918 pandemic lasted for 3 years, so we may have a little more to go, but this will pass. I mean, things are going to change, things are going to fall away, new things will sprout up. I mean, there will always be music and art. And hopefully, with this new administration that's coming in, uh, we'll we'll have a better go of it. I mean, with Trump in there, there was no music in the White House, no art, no art sensibility, no support of the arts. So it's got to get better.
Nixon
Has to.
had Duke Ellington, didn't he?
Yeah, Nixon, even Nixon had music. I mean, come on. This guy is devoid of any sort of humanity at all.
I honestly think you're right. It's sad. Um,
Anyway, let's talk about music.
yeah,
Enough of this.
I was gonna move on to. I actually so you and I met when I called you up for a music lesson, I believe, when I was trying to get my thing together. Isn't that right?
I'm not sure.
Yeah,
Where would that have been?
you were in a Brooklyn apartment, I think.
Okay. Oh my goodness. In Park Slope.
That's right. And I think I took one lesson with Joe Lovano,
Okay.
and then I kind of insulted him a little bit because see, I thought he played the solo on All of Me, right? On the Billy's Vanguard record I had turned out to be Ralph LaLama.
Oh.
So I thought sure it was Joe, but Ralph was playing his butt off, man. Oh my God, jeez. But Joe sat at the drums and played some stuff, and he showed me some conceptual things. But I was still looking for more technical aspects. So then he wrote down your number on a piece of paper, and then what you did, you had me play a tune for you, and then you said, "Well, you sound okay." So I'm like, "Ah, man, I'm confused, brother." And you said, "Well, I think who you need is George Coleman." Now that took a lot of you to send me to. You gave up some money to send me to somebody else you thought who could package what I was looking for.
Huh. So who did I send you to?
Oh, George Coleman.
Oh, I see. Right. So yeah.
I
Yeah, well, George is such a great paradigm for really finesseful playing on changes. I don't think there was anyone better that played the saxophone. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's not accurate, but he just had this eloquent, lyrical way of navigating harmony in the way he chose his notes. That particularly, during the Miles period, when early mid '60s, Funny Valentine 4 and more, live in Europe. It's just extraordinary saxophone playing, and I think a lot of guys of our generation, really paid attention to that, and as just maybe not to copy per se, but just to be inspired by the way he approached harmony vis-a-vis melody.
Yeah,
You know?
well, you sent me to the right place because he kind of chronicled the changes and how for me to practice and what I was not listening to, what I should listen to. He always played piano and he could play through rhythm changes in 12 keys, and his ear is so fast. I just never forget. I always tell a story. He had me play with him all the time, and he would stop and say, "Why'd you play that note?" And he said, "The B. You played the B. That's not in the chord. Why did you play that note?" And then he explained to me, he said, if you want to play outside of the bar, that's fine, but you need to know what you're doing and how it relates to what I'm doing.
Right,
He
right.
like you said, he just laid down a way for me to practice. And I don't think I ever got to the point of some of the cats I wanted to, but he made it possible for me to play and to understand the changes. And Hank Mobley was one of his main men, I think, though he
Oh
didn't,
yeah,
you
me
know.
too.
So
Yeah,
he, George was all about that line connection. Now he told me, Marshall, I can play outside the chord, and I did it with Miles sometimes because they used to get on me. One night I surprised them all when I said I just took it all left and went on, But he said I'm just more harmonically inclined. Then I also heard him play with Elvin Jones. You know that blues he played with Elvin's live was live at the Vanguard where he started to go like a little Coltrane for a minute.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I I don't know that, to my way of thinking, the guys that really venture outside of diatonic harmony had a systematic approach to doing that. There was something melodic in the way they shaped these sojourns, if you will, outside the diatonic chord changes that that stood up, that sort of stood up as a standalone melody. And I mean, perfect example is Coltrane, who he was so concise in what he did. I mean, he sort of came up with the giant steps harmonic progression, and then tried to think of ways to superimpose that on other things. So, you wound up having a good amount of dissonance, but this sort of self-contained shape that he would superimpose over other shapes. And it was brilliant. And I mean, so many people of my generation emulated that initially. But just that approach inspired many people to come up with a system of their own, where you work on melodies with certain relationships within the melodies that again have sort of a standalone, self-contained quality to them, and then you try to think of ways to superimpose that in settings where you get a fair amount of dissonance and abstraction, if you will.
I remember one time you and I were talking about this, and at first I do completely agree. I noticed the players who came up at the post Coltrane period, they're naturally hearing those superimpositions, and it doesn't sound like patterns and forced in patterns or harmony. It sounds a part of their vocabulary. And I usually can tell, for instance, someone like Mr. James Moody, who I respect and love, but he tried to modernize, but it ends up sounding like patterns. I think what you described is the perfect way for it being natural. But once you told me, when I said to you, how can I play something that goes against, something that sounds outside of the chord? And you just said, well, I was standing beside Randy Brecker one day, and the tune was in C, and he started out with A flat major, 1 2 3 5. So he said, Marshall, basically you can play almost anything if you know how to get back wherever you want to go.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there's the whole aspect of tension resolution. Um, you can start in diatonic harmony or not, and but if you resolve into something at some point, uh, or not. I mean, there's another approach that you could take where you're using rhythm as the focus and can almost play any note. Again, if there's sort of a self-contained quality to what you're playing, if there's a rhythmical component that fits with the groove or the rhythm that you're playing with, you can be quite adventurous. I mean, Eric Dolphy, case in point, he would play sort of with bebop rhythms, but really interesting choice of notes at times. Dave Liebman too, he plays things, that are very abstract but self-contained in some way that just sound great. You could almost play the way he plays over any setting, and it would work somehow. Oh, I lost you. Are you muted?
Sorry, so sometimes I
Yeah.
do the mute because I talk too much, Bob.
No, you don't. You don't talk to him.
uh, you and I just want to tell the people, you've been one of the nicest, kindest, I consider grand musician. To me, you're a supreme musician. Your career is just amazing to me. From playing the saxophone to the Yellow Jackets, Buddy Rich, your harmony. You're just a complete musician. But as a human being, you've been one of the kindest cats ever. You're like my mentor. Benny Golson is the same way. George Coleman is the same way. There's James Moody was. There was some cat, Poquito. There's some cats I met, man, and just So I made a list because you and I have exchanged so much talks over the years, and I wanted to ask you about the Gene Perla loft tapes. Do you know about those?
I've heard about them. Yeah, I know he had a loft down on the Lower East Side somewhere, right near the South Street Seaport, apparently, where a lot of playing went on. I think Don Elias was down there at times. Steve Grossman. I mean, that was sort of the beginnings of the formation of this band Stone Alliance, which made some really interesting recordings. I later played with them for a couple of years, late 70s and early 80s. But yeah, I knew that was a scene. The scene that I partook in was on Warren Street on the west side, uh, down in Tribeca, I guess, south of Soho, Warren Street, down near Chambers Street. And John Abercrombie and Jeff Williams, and at that time, Mark Cohen, who changed his name to Mark Copeland, and he was a saxophone player
I
at
heard.
that time. And I used to go down there. That was one of the first spots I would hang out and play regularly. And there was a lot of musicians coming through there. That
Hmm.
was a great, great scene.
So that's what one day you told me. But I remember most of the stuff you said because it hit me and made me think. You said that you mentioned it was many times you, Berg, Brecker, or Grossman, four of you playing. Is that
Well,
or
I don't
something
know.
like that? Some similar.
Uh, I did a fair amount of playing with Steve Grossman. Um, Not at that time, but a little later, like in the mid 70s. I had a loft on 28th Street, and around the corner, a guitarist named Bill Washer had a loft, and we used to play around there quite a bit. Um, in fact, there was a night. Was it a night? Yeah. So I'm working with the Buddy Rich band up the street, right on 33rd Street at Buddy's place, and we would play a show and then have a long break and then come back and play a second show. So sometimes during the break, I'd run down to Bill's loft and just play for a while. And Steve was down there and I was playing and I lost track of time. And so I ran back up to 33rd Street. I was late for the second half. And to make matters far worse, I had these big sunglasses on. I looked like an insect, and I forgot to take them off, in my haste. So I jumped up on the bandstand, and man, I just thinking back on it, I was such a fool, and Buddy, of course, he got on the microphone, stood right in front of me, and said, "So where were you?" And my answer, which was as ridiculous as my appearance and state at that time, was, "I was late." That's about all I could get out. But I did not get fired, miraculously.
Wow.
A lot of cats got fired for doing that stuff like that. But I think Buddy, he appreciated the fact that I was a musician in earnest. I really wanted to be there. And, I was really trying to play. And, Buddy, he picked up on stuff like that. If you were just jiving and not that committed to being there, he picked up on that as well. And if you were late, he'd fire you in a second, but he didn't fire me, and I'm grateful that he didn't, because subsequent to that, I learned how to arrange for big band on that band.
This is one of my little memo notes. Were you playing baritone at first in that band?
No, I started on the tenor. I was the second tenor player. Well, first Frank Vicari for a couple of weeks, then he got a gig with Tom Waits and he left, and then Steve Marcus came on. That would have been spring 1975.
Hmm.
But I did in 1980 do a tour of the UK. I played baritone on that tour.
Yeah, there's a video.
Yeah. Mhm.
Hmm. Did you have to buy a baritone or they rented a baritone?
No, I had a baritone.
Oh, you?
In fact, one of my first gigs when I got out of Manhattan School of Music was with Umir Diodato playing baritone.
Hmm.
Yeah. And man, I had a fifth floor walk up loft on 21st Street, and carrying that horn up 5 flights of stairs at the end of a night was a challenge. And yeah, somebody stole the baritone actually from the loft,
What?
and I was kind of grateful. I never replaced it. I just thought, man, this is a message from above. I'm supposed to play the tenor.
I'm laughing because I bought a baritone and I sold it because I said I'll never play it. Then the Yamaha came along. I bought that. Then I sold it angry again about it. And then once again, I get your feeling, man, because baritone just, you know.
It's a beautiful instrument, but there are guys that really play that instrument,
Yeah.
and I reside in the land of B flat. I feel most at home on
Right.
tenor and soprano, bass clarinet.
Do you ever try to play some of those Latin parts and get the baritone to pop out on some of those parts?
I did some Latin gigs on baritone. Yeah, man, just talking about playing in those salsa bands, that was a real eye opener. I mean, just the feel of that music is very particular. And, yeah, I had gone through college. I was a clarinet major. I mean, I was a pretty good reader. Um, I had played in big bands, but man, when I got on the bandstand with some of those Afro-Cuban bands, the feel was very different. And the way the note placement thing really took a minute to figure out, just to get the feeling of it right. And but God, it became such an integral part of my musicianship. I'm really, really glad I experienced that.
Hmm. Hmm. I just wanted to take 1 second. How is my volume on the microphone?
It seems good from here.
Okay. You never can really tell on this thing, you know what I mean?
Mm.
There's so many things I was thinking of, so please let me. I remember you also told me, and as you already mentioned, that's how you started arranging music. So I'm curious, did you go to college, take a course? Were you like Frank Foster and just kind of figured out how to put it all together? What happened?
I never formally studied arranging. You know, spent a good deal of time at a piano in the house where I grew up, just experimenting, learning songs by ear, um, eventually writing little tunes of my own.
Hmm.
Um, played in some garage bands, some rock and roll bands in the late 60s. Horn bands were all the rage, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Electric Flag, Tower Power. So I was the one who was enlisted to take the horn arrangements off the recordings and write out some parts. Just, through osmosis, really started acquiring some skills as a composer, arranger. I had a friend who was an aspiring recording engineer in high school, and he was looking to record music. I was looking to write music and get it recorded. So we had this nice thing going, and I made 4 or 5 demos over in his basement. And that was sort of further experience in terms of composing, producing, recording, and arranging on a small scale. But I hadn't really written for a large ensemble until I got on Buddy's band, and Buddy gave me the opportunity to write for his band, and I took it, and I wrote my first chart. It sounded halfway decent. I made a lot of mistakes, the classic mistakes one would make as an overwriting and writing too high for the brass. But by and large, it sounded good enough to inspire me to write more. And
Wow.
I did. I just kept writing. And I wrote 7 or 8 things for that band. And then, never looked back. I went from there to Thad and Mel and wrote a couple of things for them. Uh, and on from there, I was in a band with Tom Harrell and Sam Jones, and wrote 3 charts for that. I started getting some commissions, and then started my own big band around in the early '80s. Oh, actually, 1980, Mel Lewis asked me to write uh, an LP, arrange these Herbie Hancock tunes for one of his recordings. So it was just an accumulative process where I, was sort of garnering experience through writing. But once I wrote a couple of things for Buddy, I started becoming known as an arranger. And started getting calls to do stuff. So I just kept moving the pencil, and and I think in great part because I love the experience of imagining music, writing something down, and then getting it played by great musicians. There's something really spiritual and amazing about that, and to this day I feel that way.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really interesting to me, and that sounds so similar to what Frank Foster told me when I asked him how did he learn to arrange. And he said I was sitting in the Basie band, and he said I was always fascinated by just listening to the charts they were playing. He said rather than focusing on my part, many times I was listening to the voicings in the band. He said, and then
Yeah,
when he got the opportunity to write, he just started getting.
exactly. And I mean, that's what I realized. And I tell my students, if one bathes their brain with the sound of a particular music, depending upon how astute your hearing is and how detail oriented you are, you're going to ingest certain components of that music. On Buddy's band, for example, I spent a year playing every night on that band before I wrote my first arrangement. And I got to hear these wonderful charts written by some of the best arrangers in the business every night. So, I was sort of getting familiar with the shape and sound of a big band arrangement, how things would grow and evolve and change. And, there was some level of mimicry, but I think it was just sort of an amalgamation of hearing all these different writers, the way they write, and then, having clear ideas of my own musically, what I perceived as a good idea as far as having Buddy play something I wrote and maybe, in my case, implementing me as a player into the mix. And that was another thing. I was the second tenor player in that band. I didn't get to solo very much, but every chart I wrote, I put a second tenor solo in. So before too long, I was soloing quite a bit.
Was my man still on first tenor during those
Steve
years?
Marcus, yeah. I mean, he's a great musician
He's on
for
the
sure.
Gene Perla tapes, and you are. And I just discovered the Gene Perla tape, so it's fascinating to me because you had told me once years ago about these loft sessions, and many of us younger crew behind you say, I don't know, I'm 61, starting around the 80s, things were changing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, rents were going up, and the starving artist syndrome was fading into the sunset. I mean, when I hit New York and before, I mean, I started hanging out in New York around 71, 72. Rents were very affordable. And there were guys living in lofts all over the city, primarily in industrial neighborhoods. You didn't have any neighbors, and you could play virtually all night. So there were people playing day and night in the lofts, and working on music and experimenting. Quite frankly, nobody was making much money playing this music, but you paid your rent. I paid my rent by doing weddings, bar mitzvahs, occasional amateur show, teaching a little bit. I drove a cab, and then I went and played, and just it was not about money. It was solely about trying to find something to play. Trying to create some music, trying to create a vibe, try to play with people. There was a fair amount of collaborative effort going on back then. And nobody was sweating the money thing the way they inevitably started to later when rents shot up, and
Okay.
um, that really had a big impact.
Could you tell
Um,
me exactly what a loft is? See, because by the time I
yeah,
got there, I don't think they even had you know,
well, what a loft basically is just a large space that usually at some point in time was a commercial entity. Could have been a little factory, or a business of some kind. And it was, lofts, when I first discovered them, were these raw spaces. In some instances, somebody would go in there, put in some plumbing, put in a bathroom and a kitchen. The lofts I lived in were pretty bare bones. It was they were not fancy, but uh, you know it afforded you the opportunity to play any time of day and night.
wow.
And that's why we lived in them. My loft on 28th Street, it was $185 a month.
Are you serious?
Yeah, and that was in 75. I moved in there. I was in there. for a year or so. And then I met this gal. She had a loft on 21st Street between 5th and 6th, and I moved in with her. She moved out. I stayed in there for a couple more years. That was 200 a month, but that was a big space. And I had, drums and a Fender Rhodes in there and a bass amp, and guys would come over and play. And, frequently the clubs back then, they were open till 4 in the morning, like Boomers. That was open till 4 in the morning. Barbers, that was a club on Sullivan Street. I used to play in there till 2 or 3 in the morning. And then, we'd go out for breakfast, go back to my loft at 4:30, play till 7 in the morning. And then, I'd go to bed at 9 or 10 in the morning, sleep till 4. And it was an exciting time.
It seems to be a very organic and natural way to learn music. And when I did an interview with Bill Crow about a month or so ago, and he too talked about being just completely immersed in the music when he got to New York in 1950.
Well, man, that, during in the 50s and into the 60s, New York was jumping. I mean, there was the whole 52nd Street scene, of course, and clubs and record dates and television. I mean, guys were busy. My wife's dad was his name was Carl Poole. He was a trumpet player on staff at NBC. And, from talking to him and hearing stories, I mean, these guys were working day and night, and into the 60s. I mean, things change. Things always change. But even in the early 70s, the studio scene was booming. There were clubs, there were touring bands. There was a lot happening. And I was very lucky to have come up in that scene. You didn't have to be a great musician to be working back then. I mean, you had to have certain skills, and I feel like I garnered a lot of those skills, like in school, just becoming a good reader, a decent section player, and a soloist, and then adding arranging and composing to that sort of completed my arsenal of skills that I think has allowed me to do much of what I've done up to this point.
But learning to play that way develops your aural ability for the music, which is much different than what a lot of the young people have to do today. And once you told me that the environment of jazz is about playing and interacting with other players, you actually looked at me and said, I don't understand how kids learn to play today because they're all in a room by themselves.
Well, yeah. Yeah. I can say that, having had this keen interest in composing and arranging really helped my playing skills, because when I would, as you mentioned, when I would find myself in a playing situation, I was really listening to the big picture. I was really curious to see how all the parts fit together. And I think that really informed the way I play the saxophone. So rather than playing over the musicians I'm playing with, I would try to sort of play into, the crowd, and try to fit in such a way where there was a conversational element to what was happening. And I'm not sure how I developed that, other than, I heard it in, the classic recordings. I mean, I heard that level of interplay. Um, John Coltrane was one of the few, and Bird. I mean, those guys were virtuosos. They'd play a lot of information, but fundamentally, they had a foundation that made it work. And one of the mistakes I made early on was overplaying. I thought if I'm going to emulate Coltrane's intensity, I have to play a lot of notes, but I didn't have the foundation yet. And that took a minute to figure out.
I still have that problem today, and I've been fortunate to work as much as I have over the last years, and be with the Basie band and stuff. But when you sit in the big band, it's a different experience than playing in a small group, of course. And yeah, sometimes when I get on my gig, I want to play everything I've been practicing, and then when I listen back, I'm like, man, it's too much, bro. You know, so
Yeah. You
you
know,
know,
it's interesting. Being a composer, arranger, and a player, I go through periods where I'm either playing a lot and not writing, or writing a lot and not playing. And those periods when I'm not playing are kind of interesting in terms of when I go back to playing, because I wind up playing some different stuff. Some of the stuff I had played previously is no longer under my fingers. So
right.
I'm coming to the music fresh. And, we're lucky in terms of being saxophonists. It's not like playing a trumpet or a brass instrument. Like if you don't practice for a couple of days on a trumpet, you are done. Whereas saxophone, you could kind of pick it up. At least I've picked it up several times after laying off for a week or two. And I can sort of get my cheeks hurt for a minute, but it's kind of all there. I know what to do with the air and with my embouchure and so on. I know, how to relax into the music from having done it so very long. But I always like playing after a period of not playing because some other stuff comes out.
Hmm, I hear that. But
Yeah.
the next thing I wanted to talk about it, as you know, I told you before, and we had a lovely dinner with Jay Branford in Hollywood, I think it
Oh
was.
yeah, I remember that. Mhm.
Jay,
Did we go to Mikado? Or wait, where was that?
yeah, you picked a restaurant. Was it Italian food?
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, you picked a place. We had a wonderful time, man.
I don't remember, but you were staying at the Mikado, right?
Is that the
The
Japanese place?
Japanese, yeah, the
You said
hotel.
Jaco used to go there and eat all the
That's
time.
right. Yeah, Jaco took me there.
That's what it was. Wow, when you told me that, because I didn't know that. And
Yeah.
and you, I wanted to bring up. There's so many people that you played with, man, and I'm not BSing what I'm saying. You're actually one of my favorite players. I've pulled off some of your solos and the stuff, and what I mostly enjoy about your playing is the musical aspect of it and the way it communicates to the listener. You really use space, but more so, as my buddy and I Connecticut talk about, you use rhythm in your playing. And that I really feel and hear that. And when I listened to you play beside Michael Brecker, you had once told me, "There's no way I'm gonna out Brecker, so I gotta go someplace else." And I really enjoy the foil that you did against the Giant Step solo on that twin tenors.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
Because he's coming with all you know,
Yeah.
and I really enjoy your solo. It's almost like a composition. To me, it sounds like you're composing when you play, in a sense. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. That's the objective. That if you break it down, improvisation is spontaneous composition, and to be articulate in that regard, you you need to have really considered composition, as an art form, uh, particularly, as it applies to the big picture in playing, playing with a rhythm section. What is your role? What is the saxophonist's role? How do you elicit conversation? How do you play in such a way where you welcome in the other players? What rhythms might you play that either coincide or complement the rhythms the drums play, the rhythm the piano player plays with the way he comps? What is the bass doing? How do you play off of that? How do you interact with a moving bass line in some way where you acknowledge it and integrate what you're doing into that? So from my experience, just having some hands-on uh, experience playing those instruments really helped me to inform me what to do with the saxophone in that setting.
With Jaco, you played a stunning bass clarinet solos. How did the bass clarinet come in? When did you have time to practice it? And Donna Lee is the one I remember all the time.
Yeah.
And
Um,
what was it like playing with Jaco?
well, I was a clarinet major in college, so I spent many hours playing that instrument. And of course, the challenge for many saxophone players who don't start on clarinet is just that different configuration where when you push the octave key, rather than get an octave like you do on the saxophone, you get a 12th, right? An octave and a fifth. So that throws a lot of guys initially. And I mean, just the whole setup, you have these keys with, you know, it's a metal ring and a hole. You have to be extremely precise to play a clarinet where you cover the holes in such a way where it seals, because if it doesn't seal, you're going to squeak and make all kinds of extraneous noises. Anyway, that's neither here nor there as applicable to the bass clarinet, because bass clarinet has covered keys. But you know, when I picked up the bass clarinet initially, I was familiar with the fingerings and just the general feel of the instrument. The problem was it's not a highly projecting instrument compared to a tenor saxophone, say. So I would bring it to a jam session and I really couldn't hear myself well, and I don't think other people could hear me quite loud enough. Although some guys can really play the bass clarinet loud. I just wasn't one of those people. And then this movement started in New York where Michael Brecker and a bunch of guys started using pickups and electrifying their saxophone or whatever instrument they were playing and running them through effects and so on. So I sort of got swept up in that and got a Barkasbury pickup. It was a pickup where this little contact mic stuck on the reed. You'd fasten it to hold it on there, and then I'd run that through a little chorus pedal. And I found that, number one, I could hear myself. You know, I could plug that into an amplifier and have it coming out of a monitor and really hear myself clearly and feel my sound clearly. Plus, there was an interesting quality to the sound with that little chorus pedal on there. You weren't sure what you were listening to, you know, but it did have some of the qualities of bass clarinet. And so I think actually I played it before I was with Jaco. I played it on a couple of my records. I was playing it with my own gigs, and it felt really good. You know, it felt comfortable. And then with Jaco, of course, I don't know, it just fit, into the framework of that music. And the fun part of playing with him was there was no chord instrument. So it was real wide open. You could really explore and play all kinds of things. And, standing next to Randy Brecker was very inspiring. He had a very interesting way of just, sort of expanding harmonic thought. And plus, we would occasionally accompany one another, just, playing single note lines that would maybe take the place of a chord instrument, if you will. So it was very open, and we were able to kind of add and subtract and, sort of spontaneously compose our parts as we played, just due to the openness. And not that this is anything earth-shattering or new, but I think in this configuration with somebody like Jaco and the great band he had and the electric instruments, it just, it was something a little different. But I mean, for me, the role model for that was the stuff that Jerry Mulligan and Chet Baker and Stan Getz was in there, they would make those recordings. Well, it was Mulligan and Chet Baker with bass and drums, no chord instrument. And the way they soloed was so melodically oriented, you didn't miss the chord instrument at all. So I remember hearing those records and going, it'd be interesting to sort of slide that over to somewhat of a more contemporary setting.
That's one record that Bill Crow and I talked about. 1960, I think it was. Jerry Mulligan, the big band he had. Bill Crow was on bass, but no piano, just bass, drums, and it's
Right.
extraordinary. But like you said, but I see your point about that. And Bill, I asked Bill because Mel Lewis was on drums, because they locked in so strong in the rhythm. He talked about we didn't have the piano, so my focus, between drum and myself,
Right.
Jerry.
Yeah, there's an openness to that, I think, for all concerned. I think if you subtract a musician, you get some some level of more intimacy
Hmm.
in a way. And yeah, Jerry Mulligan and those guys and Chet Baker and Stan Getz, they had this beautiful melodic way of playing where they would just nail the changes,
Right.
but never sacrificing the melodic line.
So I'm
And
curious, do you think they were, I have my own opinion, but I want your opinion. Do you think they were thinking more technically, or was their approach coming from an oral concept of learning the music as a language?
I think the latter. I don't think they were thinking at all. In fact, I'll tell you a little story that Herb Alpert told me. Uh, Herb had A&M Records, of course, recorded some iconic records, some beautiful records, and I think he recorded Stan at some point. They were good friends. And Herb asked Stan to give him some, pointers on playing jazz. And so they got together, and Herb asked Stan, so Stan, should I work on my 2/5s? And Stan said, what's that? So that's a pretty good indicator. I mean, those guys, they played by ear. They learned the tunes. They learned on the bandstand. They weren't thinking technically very much at all.
Bill Crow didn't even know how to play the bass when he first got a bass job, he told me. He had been
Hmm,
through many other instruments, and
right,
the guy said, I need a bass player, and we
right,
have to play tonight.
right. Yeah.
He got a bass, and it's amazing story the way these cats learn, man. I couldn't believe it. He
Oh,
told me
yeah.
the first gig with Stan Getz, Stan didn't tell him any of the tunes and stuff. You just get to the gig,
Right, right, right.
and he also said it was a little rough because his one of his strings, I can't remember, the E string broke or something at the very first tune. So
Hmm,
he said he's trying to play, he's playing all these wrong notes, and then gets
yeah.
finds out what's happened and said, man, go fix your string or do something, get another bass.
Yeah, yeah.
And he said he didn't fire him, but it was, it's just such a different environment, which reminds me when I wrote you about 2 months ago, because I had never heard of. We call them different things, of course, just chromatic notes, I guess. I never heard of enclosures and approach notes, right? I saw this video, I wrote you an email about that, remember?
Yep.
And
Yeah. I mean, of course, if anybody that's listened to Charlie Parker, you've heard enclosures, I mean, but I wasn't familiar with that terminology until 10 years ago when I started teaching at USC. Somebody brought it up and it was like, oh, so that's what that is. I mean, a lot of things I've heard and incorporated in my playing, I didn't necessarily have the terminology for because we didn't learn that way. We learned by ear, but we learned through sort of the process of experimenting. What if I take this certain melodic shape and manipulate it in certain ways? Um, but I mean, I think as jazz became more of a pedagogic experiment, and uh, these terms, sort of more technical terms, became a little more prevalent, and that's the way people learned. I mean, the students I work with today have learned a very different way than I did. That's for sure.
it's erased a lot of the individual aspect of the music, the voices of individuals. I remember Bergonzi talks a lot in his videos about shapes and sounds, and just finding the shape and sound that he wants to
Yeah,
express
right.
rather than thinking in a technical aspect of, like, I'm
Yeah,
going to enclose this note or something.
yeah. Well, it's good to learn all those things, but at some point you need to start writing tunes as a vehicle for the way you view yourself wanting to play, and you need to kind of come up with some systems of your own, where there's certain, just through spending time at the piano, finding chord progressions or chord voicings that appeal to you, that you sort of sew together to turn into something resembling a composition that serves as a vehicle for you improvising over, and vice versa, starting with melody. coming up with, I did a lot of work with patterns and, taking a shape, say 1-4-5, and, manipulating that, maybe playing it minor thirds apart, up whole steps apart, adding a fourth note, 1-4-5-2, and go up a half step and do that again. So these patterns kind of suggest certain kind of melodies that in turn suggest a certain harmonic setting. And just through the process of composing and, sort of sewing things together, you come up with a sound. I mean, at least that's been my experience. And most importantly is being with a bunch of musicians that you can write for and play with to, work this music out and really have it come to fruition.
That's interesting. Some of that's missing nowadays. The Basie Band, Ellington Band, Buddy Rich Band. That was such an environment for so many musicians. A Lionel Hampton Band. And that whole
Well,
learning to play as a group, etc.
yeah. Well, look, I mean, a lot of that activity has migrated to university settings.
Right.
Um, a lot of great musicians are coming out of universities. I don't think you can generalize and say, the musicians coming out of universities nowadays don't have very much personality. I mean, I think there's always been a select few people that really have a distinct personality.
Right.
It's always been the case. And those people, it's some sort of gift from a higher power. And frequently, these are people that just got the bug very early and just went all in to being an artist and a musician, and got to play a lot and write a lot, and just really put a lot of energy into developing and having a vision of one kind or another. Really, made them a very distinctive artist with a strong personality. I mean, look at Coltrane. I mean, it just doesn't get any stronger than that, right? I mean, he was a killer bebop player, but he had a sound way back, right from the beginning. He had a very distinctive sound, in the 50s, mid to late 50s. And even the way he played, like on those Miles records, it wasn't Bird, it was something else. It was him. But he probably worked harder than anybody else. From what I hear, he just practiced day and night, and not just jazz. He looked at classical music and composers, and was just looking far and wide for inspiration and ideas, and just continued to collect and create this stew of music and ideas, and eventually it spilled over into this conceptual thing that was all his own.
Yeah, I just discovered the Gene Perla tapes 2 weeks ago. You're on some of them in Europe, some places with Gene, and it's Grossman. There's no Bob Berg on any of these, but Michael Brecker, young Michael Brecker, Dave Lehman. It was interesting for me to hear Lehman in that free environment. Man, he was extraordinary. I mean,
Oh yeah,
it's
yeah.
just
Liebman, he's a
it,
beast.
his
What,
playing changed over the years, but during that particular time period, it was a and what was interesting, what I think you had told me once, Michael Brecker was not as developed as Grossman or Lehman at a particular time, 1970.
um,
You can hear it on the
it's hard
tape.
to say. It's hard to say. I mean, like all of them, and myself included, were Coltrane devotees.
You can hear that.
To varying degrees. But I remember hearing Dave Liebman in 1970 play with Elvin's group. And it was Elvin and Frank Foster and Gene Perla
Hmm.
and Jan Hammer. And Liebman scared me half to death. I mean, he was just so fluid and strong. Frank Foster was also on that gig. Um, so Dave he was really a strong player from very early on. And then I
I
heard, Grossman also, I think 17, right? Miles live at the Fillmore. Uh, you know, coming out of the Coltrane bag, but very creative, very dynamic player.
My friend and I, even before Lehman started, well, I guess he said it first. We always called it the Great New York Jewish Saxophone School. Someone needs to write a book about
Yeah,
it, man, 'cause it's just.
right.
And Lehman referred to it as the Jewish saxophone mafia or something like that.
Yeah, I use that term. Yeah,
But
yeah.
what's interesting to me was that everyone had latched on, especially for some reason, some of the black players were lagging behind in this, and I don't know why. Had latched on to the Coltrane movement, the spirit of it, the sound of it, the study of it, and the whole rhythm section was all birthed by Coltrane. It sounds to me.
Well, you know, uh, there was a contingent of people that were not fond of the fact that people were emulating Coltrane,
Hmm.
honestly. Um, it's sort of a slippery slope, you know. I mean, I think there was a lot of criticism waged at white players back then, you know, imitating Coltrane, uh, because I think the mindset was find your own shit, you know.
Oh,
And um, I, I mean, eventually, I think I did. I think we all did to greater or lesser extents. Um, for me, it was really about having a clear and broad understanding of saxophone playing. A lot of young players, myself included, make the mistake of focusing on one or two players. And back then, when I came up, the guys that everyone listened to were Sonny Rollins, Joe Henderson,
mhm.
and Coltrane. I got on Buddy's band, and my playing was missing certain key components of the older thing. And Buddy, he got in my face, and I'm forever grateful. He said, you got to check out some other stuff, because he had the sound of Coleman Hawkins and Ben Webster and
Oh,
Bird in his ear, because
right.
those were the guys he came up playing with. So when I went back into the shed and started studying those guys, I think it filled out my playing
That
and
makes
made me sound a little different than, a Coltrane imitator, shall we say. But then, there's, I don't know. For me, learning music was very much environmental. I was hanging out with Mike Brecker, was doing record dates with him. We were playing together, hanging out, and I started to sound like him. And it took me many years to kind of shed that. I mean, in the studios, a producer would say, play a solo like Mike Brecker.
you told
Plus,
you
there
told
was no one better really
right.
at playing a contemporary sounding R&B tenor solo at that time than Mike. I mean, Grover Washington, and then there were the early guys, King Curtis and Junior Walker, but Brecker, put some of the, just more virtuosic, sort of Coltrane oriented, and some more abstraction onto R&B playing. And of course that unusual combination morphed into, the Brecker brothers, and
Right.
that combined with the music Randy was writing with the sort of polychordal stuff that, sort of created a whole thing that had a very distinctive sound.
You opened up my mind to something I didn't completely understand because I have no problem with the lineage. I don't think Charlie Parker had any problem with the lineage. He didn't see white and black players. He either I like your playing or I don't like your playing. Basically, with it, he seemed to like almost everyone's playing. From what I've heard, Charlie Parker was not a very negative person about music. Um, so for me, it was a natural lineage. But I remember at University of Pittsburgh, Nathan Davis was very upset when I said Michael Brecker was one of my favorite players, and this was even before Michael was really well known, and and yeah, I mean, it just really upset him so much that he said something in front of the class about it.
Mm.
And I didn't really understand it, but what you said opened up my mind when you said some people weren't approving of just copying Coltrane or something.
Yeah. The thing with Mike Brecker was he went well beyond that.
Of
And,
course.
again, look, if you look at it in terms of every musician is sort of cooking a stew, and everybody puts in slightly different ingredients. Well, Mike, he made a hell of a stew because he combined all the great players in his own unique way. I mean, he really did some homework. And not only that, but he learned how to play the hell out of the saxophone. So you might not like stylistically what he was doing, but it would be very hard to contest his prowess on the instrument and his knowledge of the history of playing that instrument. Um, Again, there was environmental considerations. He did a fair amount of R&B recordings and studio work. So, and he, like many of us of that generation, we didn't just listen to bebop, we listened to all kinds of music. So it's inevitable that, there would be these other influences.
Yeah. But I grew up listening to Chicago, the Eagles, Earth, Wind and Fire. Dave Sanborn was one of my first favorite, man. So, and then I heard Michael Brecker play on "Don't Let Me Be Lonely Tonight." Remember that solo?
Yeah.
It's beautiful, man.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just a different generation, and most musicians are broad enough to just listen to the music and decide if they like it or not. I do remember around 1980, Donald Harrison, a lot of people started coming up, and things started to change. Branford Marsalis was coming out, Wynton Marsalis, and Black Coast from Underground. And it seemed people became more comfortable with whichever direction the music was going. And Mike was so strong. I mean, I have loved Michael Brecker from the first time I got a record in high school, man. So I just it hits me, it resonates with me, man. And I wanted to get to a story you told me. You said once you were in playing with some kind of European musician and some really hard tune, you told me, with a whole like a million chord changes or something, and it was you and Mike Brecker in the recording studio. Do you remember telling me that story?
Yes, I do. Yeah, it
Can,
was Joachim Kuhn, piano player, German piano player. We were doing a record of his music in New York. It was me and Mike. I want to say Eddie Gomez, and I'm not sure who was playing drums. Um, and it was a really difficult tune with a lot of slash chords and rapidly changing harmonic progression. And we didn't get the music in advance, so we were basically sight reading these fairly complex changes. And I had a solo first, and I was buried in the part and what felt like struggling through this tune. And I stopped, and Mike soloed after me, and I was sort of staring at the floor, like feeling sorry for myself. And I hear this absolutely exquisite tenor playing next to me. It sounds like this guy came out of the womb playing this tune. And I look over, and his eyes are closed. He's not even looking at the music. And I got mad. I just, at the end of the take, I said, "How were you able to do that? That was extraordinary." And he said something like, "Ah, man, I was just bullshitting." I said, "The hell you were. You were making every change. Like you've been playing that tune for a decade." And he had that level of intuition, and he was somebody who could suss out a piece of music very quickly, and sort of internalize the form and the shape, and come up with something to play on it. And the only way you get to that level, I mean, you have to have extraordinary ears and talent, of course, but you get to that level by having really studied the music thoroughly and played, a lot over a lot of different settings, so that you're familiar with any sort of harmonic setting that might be thrown in front of you. And, Lord knows he was somebody, he was playing on people's records left and right, and, really had a lot of experience, which is why he was able to do what he did.
Yeah, I remember reading with about Will Lee saying how Mike would practice well into 4 a.m. in the morning after he get back to the apartment, and I had another thought. I completely escaped my brain now. I remember. It was actually it was actually you I called when I heard the terrible news that Michael Brecker passed away. And I
Mm.
gave you a phone call, and you were kind enough to return to little old me and just tell me how sad you were. I never forgot that moment. You know.
Yeah, Mike was he was a beautiful human being and somebody I'd known for quite a while. I guess we met around 75, I want to say, and spent time hanging out and uh, played on recordings. We yeah, we were friends, and um, I saw less of him as time went on. We went up to visit him and his family in Hastings on the Hudson and wound up moving up there. And I mean, I lived a few minutes away from him, but ironically, I would mainly see him like in Europe. I would occasionally see him at the school because our kids went to the elementary school there, but more often than not, we were both busy. And I was traveling a lot with the Yellow Jackets, and he was busy with his own band or whatever he was doing, playing with Steps Ahead or Paul Simon, myriad of people. But we'd run into each other in Europe every now and then. But he was just such a wonderful, warm-hearted guy and very generous and kind, and somebody with a big personality that made a big impression on you. And everyone he met felt like they were his best friend. He made you feel that way, like you were his best friend. That's a really special quality, especially for somebody prominent like him, who's in the limelight. And I imagine there'd be a lot of people sort of seeking him out, but he always had time to talk to folks. And
I,
that
I
was
can I can testify to that because he made me feel important. I had met him maybe traveling with Basie or something, or I forget when. It doesn't matter. Years ago, maybe he gave me his phone number or something, and I got to call him 3 times, and he was just so nice and down to earth and wonderful. In fact, at one point, and every time he said something to me, I learned something. I can't tell you how much I learned from the things he would say. One time he said, "Oh man, I got another call. I got to take the call, but call me back because I want to keep talking." It's just I
yeah,
can't tell you because I loved this man's music for so long, and then this to think I'm talking to this dude who, what I'm saying, who's been my idol for years, and I'll never get close to his playing. But just such a loving, generous person, man.
yeah, he loved to talk about music. He loved to hang out. um, he was very unassuming. He didn't have a big ego. If anything, it was the opposite. He was very inquisitive, always wanting to learn more. And I remember we were doing a Yellow Jackets record out here in L.A., and I had just recorded a tune I had written, and I called Mike just to say hello, and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "We're doing a Yellow Jackets record." He said, "Yeah, let me hear something." So I held up the phone, and it was this tune I had written. He said, "Man, how do you write like that? That's amazing." I said, "Shoot, how do you write like you do? I think So he was always very inquisitive and very eager, and supportive of. He saw something of redeeming quality in everybody and what they did. It was very refreshing.
Randy is the same way. I met Randy years ago, and I can still write Randy, and he'll write right back. He's also just as a supportive, to me. But his harmonic playing, I really love Richie Byrack. When he was played one night, play some standards with Lehman,
Oh yeah,
and then Randy's just so slick and polished with, but when it sounds like Randy, I can always tell it's Randy. I know it's Randy.
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Randy is a remarkable trumpet player. I mean, he's a amazing improviser and composer. That goes without saying, but his prowess on the trumpet is nothing short of extraordinary. I mean, to this day, I mean, he really plays that instrument so beautifully. such a great and distinctive sound, and in tune. And I mean, he played on most of my big band records,
Hmm.
and man, he did it all. Again, somebody who had such a wide swath of different experience. He could do anything, and when he did his thing, it was really remarkable.
Man, it seems I could talk to you for 2 or 3 hours. I really, I really enjoy everything you're saying. I wanted to ask you, and maybe we'll have to do a second one or something because I don't know what time is it. Do you know?
Well, we've been talking for almost an hour and a half.
Wow, it seems like
Yeah,
5 minutes.
yeah, I agree. Well, hey man, it's fun. It's fun to talk about music and art, and I appreciate you, man. It's nice to do this. So
But I wanted to hear. I can always cut this in half, I guess, if you got a couple more minutes.
yeah,
I,
sure.
you told me some really great, and I'm not making fun of Jaco because I love Jaco, and I'm really sad that we lost so many folks. Jaco, Mike Brecker, Bob Berg. I just don't get it, man. And certain people still living. The universe is weird. But you told me some. I know Jaco suffered from some very serious conditions, and I get that, and that runs in my family. I understand that. But you said one story once that you and Randy were on stage. You guys did some kind of intro for a tune, the first tune, and I forget. You said you're supposed to play the tune and each blow a little bit, and then Jaco comes on. But you said no Jaco. You remember that story?
I do remember. It's for all to see. It's we did this. We did a um, I think commercially marketed DVD at the Montreal Jazz Festival in 1981,
Oh yeah.
and it's all over the internet. But we were supposed to play this tune I wrote called Mr. Phone Bone, and we're going to just do a short little intro, like tenor and drums, and then start the tune. Well, as it were, Jaco, we all took the stage except for Jaco. He was not there. He disappeared and was disappeared for about 5 minutes, I want to say. So we were vamping and duetting and trioing and whatever we could manage, just to sort of keep the momentum going. He finally showed up about 5 minutes into the tune, and then we played the tune. It was that kind of situation, very unpredictable.
You also told me another time that he came from the back of the stage, but through the audience with his bass.
Oh, that was yeah. Was it there? It was somewhere where he had his road manager uh, put on a hat and sort of with his back to the audience go out with the bass on up to the amp. But so Jaco went up and to a balcony and jumped off the balcony and ran down through the audience, and jumped up on the stage. he was always he was always carrying on and doing these funny little prankster type things. He liked doing that.
Yeah, I grew up at the time, so I grew up listening to Weather Report every morning and Earth, Wind, and Fire, and but as you said, I just didn't grow up at the time where you put on Charlie Parker. I had Charlie Parker in high school too, but I remember listening to Weather Report. And then I got that. You remember the Jocko record replaced Donnelly and all that?
Oh yeah, I
These were
remember
records. You remember records?
that was a groundbreaking. I remember when I got that record, I wore it out.
Mhm.
That would have been in '75, around there sometime.
Yeah.
Yeah, extraordinary.
Sure. How'd you get the gig with Jocko?
I think Mike told him about me, and he had left Weather Report. He wanted to start his own band,
Hmm.
and so I bumped into him at the Vanguard, and he said, "You want to play in my band?" I said, "Well, yeah, let's check it out." So we did a quick rehearsal. It was me, Mike, Don Elias, and Erskine, and Jaco, and we
Hmm.
played at 7th Avenue South. That would have been 1981, and yeah, that's where it started. And I played with him for about 2 years, 81, 82, and it was a combination of small group and big band. We did a bunch of big band hits and, several small group hits as well. And
Wow.
it was really challenging and fun.
Hmm. Last, I just had a question about the WDR band and your relationship with that band. I have a couple friends in there, Carolina and Andy Hunter from New York, and you're doing wonderful work there. How's that experience?
Wonderful. It's great. It's they're such a good band, and it's probably the closest thing you're going to get to, bands of olden days, the bands that used to tour and play together all the time. There's a certain cohesiveness, and the WDR big band, they have a long, full season, so they know how to play together. So you bring some music in there, they know how to make it sound great.
Hmm.
So it's a real joy working for them, and I've worked with that band for 30 years on and off. I mean, you know, intensively for the last 6 years. So I know how to write for them, and I know who does what. And man, it's big fun. And what what a great situation where you get to record uh, for a week. It's like when I did my big band records here in the States on DMP or even the MCG stuff, it would be 2 days of recording tops, 4 or 5 hour sessions. That would be it. But man, to be able to go over there and record/rehearse for 5 to 10 days and then play a couple of concerts, you really get to, number one, get a great recording. But number two, really, work on the music, really work it out and without having to rush and, be stressed out. We did the last Yellow Jackets record with the WDR. It's called Jackets XL. And man, it just turned out great. I mean, the band just killed it. And the Yellow Jackets in that band was pretty stunning, pretty powerful. So it's nice seeing. I'm very grateful to be there.
You've had a lot of great things. How long have you been with the Yellow Jackets? And now I do remember we were someplace on a jazz festival and you were with the Yellow Jackets maybe 20, 25 years ago, maybe a couple times. I don't remember. But how
Uh,
long have you been with the Jackets?
31 years.
31 years.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a
Yeah.
gig.
Yeah. That's home, baby. Home.
Man, that's a blessing, man.
When you play, well, now, Russ is sort of the original member, but, there's something really compelling about long-standing musical relationships where you can get to another level totally. You learn how to live together, to breathe together, to phrase together, and there's something really unique about that.
That's a
And
great
same
band.
with same with the WDR band, that's a long-standing relationship. Same with the guys that I, made most of my big band records with, long-standing relationships.
I love your big band records. I think one of my favorites. Don't you have one called Art of the Big Band? Is that it?
Yeah,
Is that it?
90.
Yeah. I love that. And you know the other one I love that recorded your small group in a studio with quality time.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
I love the sound you're playing. It's extraordinary on there for me,
Oh,
man.
thank you. That was a really nice project to do. We did it up at Carriage House in Stamford. Malcolm Pollock was the engineer. Just the stars aligned that weekend, and we got a really nice recording out of there. And it was for an unusual label. It was called TVT Records. It was a big company at the time that made these TV tunes recordings of television show theme songs, and they they recorded a bunch of fairly prominent artists. Ja Rule and Nine Inch Nails was on that label for a minute. Um, and I happen to know the owner through my brother, and I coerced him into doing a jazz record,
Hmm.
and it was very cool. Uh, I still like listening to that record. Every now and then I sort of stumble onto it. It's like, all right,
It's a really beautiful sounding record you're playing. It's wonderful. I like the vamp and the giant steps. There's everything on there I just really enjoy, man. That's a different record, by the way. But I like the vamp,
yeah,
not giant.
Giant Step. That
It's a
was twin tenors. Yeah.
it's a vamp on. You wrote a tune, something about something called saxophone, and there's a vamp at the end.
That's on twin tenors.
No, but even before that, not Giant Steps, on Quality Time. I can't remember the name of it. It's
Yeah.
something about the saxophone. The title's about
Well, there
saxophone.
was a tune called The Saxophone
I think that's it.
on twin tenors,
That's
I
a good.
think.
I
Yeah.
can't. It all starts to gel together after a certain age, man.
Yeah. Man, tell me about it.
Well, look, I wanted. I can't go too long and take too much of your time. I was hoping to ask you about your practicing habits and musical stuff for people who are interested. Maybe we can do another short one some other time or some other day.
Yeah. I'd be happy to, Marshall.
But man, it's
Yeah.
wonderful to talk with you, man. You want one of my favorite players and one of the nicest cats in the business, man. So
Well, back at you.
well, I'm gonna have to
Yeah.
try to get back to practicing again. I don't know about you, but I just
Well, we all need to get back to a bunch of stuff. Hopefully that will be the case
right.
sometime in the not too distant future. And man, this is life is really about love and respect, and hanging in there,
Yeah.
and that's what we're doing.
Right.
So
Thanks, Bob. Hey, man,
grateful for the opportunity.
yep. Thank you so much. Be
Yeah,
safe, and we'll
yeah,
talk
you
soon.
too.
All right.
All right. Well, we'll talk again.
Okay. Take care, brother. When I hit the thing, everything goes away.
Okay. All right. We'll see.